I will give you some last results from the European research that we got during the last 20 years, and some of the results are very recent. They are from this year, to show you what we intend to do in Europe to intensify in an ecological way our agriculture. First, you may know where I'm coming from Montpellier city. It's in the south of France, near the Mediterranean Sea, and that's the main center in France for agronomical research, including tropical research and Mediterranean research. I would say that if we look back at the history of intensification in agriculture during the last century, we come back, we have been doing a long way to segregation of uses. We have been intensifying by specializing the land. Today, you are doing forestry or agriculture or energy production or nature conservation, but this is on different land. And the avenue that we explore at the moment is how to mix these uses on the same land to have better approaches for production. So the ideal landscape for crop production was that kind of landscape during, well, I would say the 80s, the 60s, the 80s. But we try to bring back something else in the landscape, like trees on the planet again. So why not mix? And that's the question that we have addressed in our studies. In the old times, I would say back to the 18th century, in Europe at least, we had mixtures everywhere. We had trees on farms everywhere. We had crop, animal, and wood for fire production on the same plots. So that was mixtures everywhere. So the last century was simplifying the system to intensify, to mechanize, and would it be possible in the future to get better systems by complexifying again the system, by mixing uses? And so it's really something that looks like back to what future? So, as was said, if we mix trees, animals, and crops, that's agroforestry. If we mix photovoltaic panels and crops or animals, it's what we have called agrivoltaicism. That's a new word that we forged. I don't know if it's suitable, but we use it. I would say that these systems are more complicated to manage, of course. And they are heterogeneous, they are stratified. We are looking for a facilitation, which are the processes that improve one component by the others and vice versa. And competition, of course, is inside the system, so we have to manage competition. So this is what it looks like if we try to do it. So we have trees and crops on the left. That's one of our experimental plots that we manage from plantation of the trees until harvest of the trees. Or on the right side of the slide, you have an agrivoltaic prototype that we study at the moment. So agroforestry systems, trees and crops, designed for allowing the farmers to use its machinery without changing it, and so it should be really easy to use by the farmer. Agrivoltaic systems look like from the bottom and from the top, so you have the photovoltaic panels and the crops besides them. Let's look at agroforestry. So why to bring trees back in the cropped areas or the grazed areas? Trees do make a mess. Of course, it's not easy to manage traditional agriculture with trees. And that's, of course, one of the main concerns of farmers when we talk to them about agroforestry. And the question was, is it really efficient to mix or not to mix? This is a very traditional system in southwest of France. We produce poplars for fibers, and we produce maize, corn for food. But there was a lot of traditional systems in Europe where the trees and the crops were mixed. And you have a few examples here, like walnuts and lavender, like trees in the picture on the top right is from the central basin of France, where today you don't have a single tree. And this postcard is from 2020. So you see the change that occurred during the last century. And the other examples are in Spain or in Normandy in France. And this postcard also is interesting. I graduated from a very well-known college of forestry and agronomy in France. It's near Paris. And this is what looks like my school, my college, 100 years ago. There were cows and trees everywhere, and today it's only crops. So that was the past, and these systems of the past have been very difficult to manage with the modern machinery. This is an example of what we call a gymkhana. You know, you have to move around the trees. It's olive trees in Greece with wheat. And we have also very traditional system, very intensive system, mixing fruit trees and vegetables, like this, close to Montpellier. We also have trees aligned around the parcels, hedges, many different ways to manage the trees. This is what we call the pollarded trees. They produce fodder for the animals, but they produce also wood. And we have also, so those were all the old traditional systems. And that's what's happening at the moment in Europe. This guy is a French farmer. He wears the hat, but he is a French farmer. And he's planting trees back in his farm. And at the moment, we are planting a lot of new trees on farms in France. And that's something that we have to explain. So we did experiments to understand how it works and if it's useful or not. This is one of our major experimental farms. The trees grew, and at the end, when the trees were very tall, we had wheat under the trees. That's kind of forest wheat, which was never studied before. And we had a number of experiments throughout Europe in different countries. I won't detail all the examples, but that's what we base our results on, including in the center picture here, you have vineyard agroforestry, trees and vineyards. You may know that the traditional system of cultivating vineyards by the Roman times was to grow vineyards on trees. Trees were the post for the vineyards. And we also had the chance to have some pioneer farmers who did agroforestry before we studied that. And this is an example of Mr. Claude Jolet. He's a farmer in the west part of France, and he planted 40 hectares of agroforestry 50 years ago. And that's very convenient for us because we can study the system until trees are very large. And that's his plot. So to address the question of is it feasible, is it productive, we managed some experimental plots from tree plantation, you can see here in 1996, until tree harvest in 2010. And that way we could measure the tree production, the crop production. We could measure the tree production in a forest-only plot. We could measure the crop production in a monocrop plot nearby. And we could evaluate the efficiency of the system in production. This is the land equivalent ratio concept. I just explained you briefly. If you have 1 hectare, I'm sorry, I'm still with the old metric system. If you have 1 hectare and you do agroforestry on your farm, you will produce, let's say, timber and wheat and cereals. You could produce the same amount of timber and cereal by separating the 2 crops in an agricultural plot and a forest plot. If this is the situation, if you need 1.4 hectare to produce the same amount as 1 hectare of agroforestry, we say that we have a land equivalent ratio of 1.4. It means that there is a 40% increase in productivity of the land. In this plot, we had a 1.36 land equivalent ratio. So it is really producing. It is highly intensive production without more inputs. It's only intensive production by ecological means, not by increasing the inputs that you put in the system. And for other systems, like walnut trees, like the pecan trees and winter cereals, it could be as high as 1.4 to 1.6. This is not measured yet because the rotation is longer. It's predicted by simulation models. So if you go back to the farmer, a 1.4 land equivalent ratio means that if you have a 100 hectare farm, by practicing agroforestry, you produce as much as if you had a 140 hectare farm, which is really a good point. So the land equivalent ratio doesn't explain what makes the system working, okay? It's a black box. We don't know what's happening really inside the system. So our studies at the National Institute for Agronomical Research in France are to elucidate what the processes are important in the system. And we do a lot with the roots. It has a lot to do with below ground processes. So for example, here we study the roots of the trees in agroforestry to see how they behave. And a very important result is that the root profile for a tree is very different if it's in a forest plot or if it's in an agroforest plot. On the left, you have a forestry, that's for walnut trees, the European walnut tree. And you have the depth on the X line down to 4 meters. You see that in the forestry plot, most roots are in the topsoil, in the first meter, and almost nothing down. In the agroforestry plot, we have a lot of roots in the second and the third meter of soil. And this change is very important for the complementarity between the trees and the crops. And the explanation is that the competition by the winter wheat is so strong that in spring, when the walnut tree starts to grow, the topsoil is already quite dry, and the tree has to go down to find water. And in that way, during the summer, we have no rain in summer, just like in California, the tree behaves much better because it has deep rooting. What about light? Light competition, shadow of trees is a very feared problem for farmers. So we measured exactly the light competition between trees and crops, and those are the budget for light use in the system. On the left, you have the cropping system, the monocropping system. The black area is the light that is not used by the crop, and the red one is the one that is used by the crop. On the right, you have the forestry system. The black, again, is not used by the trees, and the green is used by the trees. And in the middle, you have the agroforestry system. The black is what is left by the trees and the crops. And you see that in the budget, the agroforestry system is much more efficient in capturing the light of the sun. That's one explanation, among others, for the functioning of this agroforestry system. I don't have the time here to explore all other aspects between these trees and crops, but there are other very interesting that could be displayed. It's also important to say that farmers are attracted now in Europe because those agroforestry systems allow us to get improved landscapes that are very attractive to people. And also, we are working on the variability of trees, of the crops, production of the crop yields across years. Those are simulation with a simulation model, but you have in dark, in black, the line of the variability of a wheat crop during 40 years, depending on climate hazards, okay? And you have the variability of the crop as an intercrop with the trees. That's the red and green line. So the variability is much lower when you have trees and crops together. So that's a system that we are exploring in the moment to increase the resilience of cropping systems to climate change. Of course, you have a decrease of the yield because in that experiment, the trees were too close. If you have wider space between the trees, you won't have that sharp decrease of the yield of the crop. But one very important point is that all the crop varieties that we use at the moment in Europe, and probably in the United States too, have been selected by geneticians in the full light of the sun. Now we are starting to select new varieties for crops that are selected in the shade of trees to have, because we know that there is a potential increase in productivity, a huge potential increase in productivity if we select the species that are adapted to the tree shades. That's also important for animals, climatic protection, and farmers, ranchers know about that. So we plant a lot of trees in areas that are grazed by animals, including by cattle, and we are working on special devices to protect the seedlings against the cattle so that you don't lose the grazing during the years when the tree is too small and may be damaged by the cattle. It's also true for sheep production. That's not far from Montpellier. Well, you see that they love, each cow has her tree. Anyway, it's also important for crops. The map on the left displays what the models predict about crop production in Europe during the next 50 years due to climate change. When it's red or brown, it's heavy losses of production due to high temperature in spring, hydric stress, thermal stress, and so on. So we are really working on new agroforestry systems that will prevent this kind of problem. And that's quite a new problem in Europe. These are the yields of most cereals in Europe during the last century. And you can see that there was a sharp increase of yield production since the 50s up to the 90s. But since the about 95, crop yields in Europe do not grow at all. They are stagnating. And we have been studying why they are stagnating. And there are a lot of hypotheses that have been scrutinized. And the only one explanation at the moment is climate change. We also have to face, disastrous events like floods, flash floods. You have a picture here of the Pont du Gard, which is the most famous Roman bridge in Europe. And this was a flood that occurred in 2003, and it's probably the highest flood that the bridge had to cope with since it was built 2,400 years ago. So we have a lot of floods like that, and of course a landscape with trees is like a sponge that keeps water during the flash flood events, and we are working on that to prevent such events. We also have very strong storms that occurred in Western Europe during the last decade, like this one. And I will give you an example. You remember the pioneer farmer that I presented to you. So the picture down is his farm after the storm, and he was exactly in the eye of the cyclone here. He had only 40 trees uprooted by the storm, while the next forest, a forest that's just close to his farm on top, was totally destroyed. Because those agroforestry trees, they swing all the time in the wind, so they are much more resistant to strong winds than forest trees. When in a forest there is a gap, all the forest is going down, and that's what we are experiencing in Europe at the moment. And we can also have additional production. People produce Christmas trees, palm trees that grow very slowly and that nurseries can't produce, or any other kind of production. I won't elaborate on carbon storage because it has been perfectly described this morning and before. So it's also a very important incentive for agroforestry in Europe at the moment. And finally, my final word is that we are working on that with simulation model, numerical models, because we can't wait for hundreds of years that our experiments come to an end. What about agrivoltaics? So agroforestry is quite an old system that we try to revive, but agrivoltaics is something different. It's producing energy and crops together. So it's also the concept of a dual system where we produce two things together. I just want to recall you about very basic facts. At the moment, solar energy on the Earth is plentiful and renewable and could provide all the energy that we need. And photovoltaics is at the moment the most efficient conversion process from the sun to electricity, because photosynthesis has a very low percentage, yield percentage compared to photovoltaic panel. And the result for that is that if you want to move a car with energy from the sun, you have two possibilities. You can grow a crop and make ethanol, for example. So for an average European car with 1 hectare, you can drive the car for 22,000 kilometers with 1 hectare of crop. But if you use an electric engine and photovoltaic panels, you can drive the car 150 times more. So there is no way that crops for ethanol or diester or second generation wool plants use for gas can compete with photovoltaic panels and electric engine in the future. So that's why we are searching new ways to produce energy with photovoltaic panels, but not to compete too much with agricultural land. Because in Europe, agricultural land is limited. Good quality agricultural land is limited. And good quality agricultural land is very often close to the cities where we want to put those electric panels. So that's why we are working on this dual system, this agrivoltaic system. So that's what it looked like. It's a new project. We started 3 years ago, and we were probably the first on the planet to do that. But since then, there has been new teams everywhere doing the same thing. You will have some examples later. So from the top, you see mostly the panels, but below you have the salads, you have the vegetables. And so we do the same experiments, comparing the crop production without panels and the crop production under the panels to measure the land-acre ratio of the system. So, okay. So we do that with several species of vegetables, with cereals, with different, and we monitor exactly the crop production and crop physiology in the shade of the system. It's also designed to be mechanized, and so the clearance is enough for the harvesters and everything. And so we have done a number of studies on this system. So what's the answer? What's the question? We got surprisingly high yields of plants in the shade of photovoltaic panels, much more than the reduction of light. And that's impressive because they are even much more efficient than agroforestry system. The land-acre ratio varies between 1.3 to 1.7, which means that if you have, again, a 100 hectare farm, you will produce as much as if you have a 130 to 170 hectare farm. The range depends on many aspects. I won't go into the details. So the results with this was an experiment with fixed photovoltaic panels that don't move. And so the result are high land-acre ratios, and we could find systems where the crop yield is normal, not decreased, but you have to decrease the density of panels for that. We save water because the crops in the shade don't use as much water as the crops in the full sun, and it's highly profitable when you crop some high added value crops under it. So that's the diminution, that's the decrease of the radiation on the crop under the panels for two densities of panels, full density on the left and half density on the right. You see that with the full density of panels at the latitude of Montpellier, which is 42 degrees latitude north, we have a reduction. We have only 45% of relative radiation on the crop. We have 45 reduction, but we have much more production. We don't have that reduction in the production of the crop. There are processes that improve the crop production, and it's not reduced proportionally to the reduction of in light. So we are working on that, and that's an example of a result from this year. This experiment, I got these figures 2 weeks ago. So we measured this year some cereals under the photovoltaic panels. There is a yield reduction, full sun, panels at half density and panels at full density. So there is a yield reduction, of course, but the quality of the wheat is greatly improved in the shade. And that's the vitreousness, that the parameter that we have down. The less the parameter is, the best it is. And that's what the farmer gets the money from. It's durum wheat, it's for pasta, and you have to have a low vitreousness percentage for the wheat. So this compensated totally the decrease in the yield because it pays for the quality. Now we start a new development on agrivoltaic systems, because you could have fixed panels, but you could also have mobile panels on trackers, panels that follow the sun during the day, and that could be very interesting, and that's a new study that we started this year. In that case, if you need shade on the crop because it's too hot, because the physical stage of the crop is at a point where it doesn't need too much light, you could put shade and produce electricity. If it's if it's a physical stage of the crop where you do need light on the crop, like flowering or the anthesis period before flowering, you will drop the panels so as to give more light to the crop. And at night, if you want to avoid chilling, the frost, you could put the panels in a way that it reduces the radiation to the sky. So that's a new system where you can manage the system, optimize the system, both for electricity and crop production. And it's a new research that we recently started. So that's agrovoltaics with trackers. It offers new opportunities, I think, for new systems that could be very interesting near big cities, where you have to produce local food, local vegetable, but you have also to produce electricity, energy, and that could be very interesting if it's a win-win system. That's what we are exploring at the moment. So this is the prototype that we have designed with trackers, and those are models of simulation of light radiation under the trackers. And this is what it looks like. We built that this spring, so it's brand new. We don't have results so far, just to show you what we are doing. And those are the first crop that we installed 2 months ago, salads, under the system. But this is not, we are not the only on the planet to do that. I give you some other examples. Those are colleagues in Italy, Revolution Energy Maker. It's a company in Italy working on the same process with different approach, but again, you have trackers, biaxial trackers that move in two direction. And these systems are also designed for a mechanized agriculture beneath. We have also a lot of work on glass houses, photovoltaic glass houses, and I can certify you that there are a lot of glass houses sellers that sell spies in the sky, because they sell glass houses where there is no light for the crops. So you can't have both. You have to compromise. So be careful with that. There are a number of studies or glass houses, photovoltaic glass houses, that are really bullshit. And finally, we have projects taking shape now with agrivoltaics that are more serious. This is an example with a company in Germany we work with. It's a project in Egypt to produce potatoes for Europe. And that would be an agrivoltaic system where the panels would produce local electricity to pump the water to irrigate the potatoes. And so I'm not sure it's a good idea, but to show you, it's something that's coming out of age at the moment and could be interesting for the future, including in very dry environments where there is a lot of sun. Well, my conclusion could be that complex is probably beautiful too, because we have been simplifying all the systems during the last century, but getting into more complexity could be efficient, as I showed you in these results. So the trees are not there just for esoteric purposes. Of course, they complicate the system, but they could also help to both product and protect the environment at the same place. And that's what we observe in our plots, where the biodiversity is increased by the presence of the trees, from the bats to many unknown species that we ignored before we started these studies. So that's something very important. But you don't you need to be careful. It's not always the solution. Don't try to make people dream of a new Eden, of a new paradise. Okay, that's not so easy. This is what we would. This is not agriculture. Okay, that's design. That's something else. But it has to be. Be careful also about the use of trees. Most people look for the tree that will save their farm or or the planet. And I went into that mistake also. These were Polovnia trees that I brought back from China 20 years ago. They looked so promising. That's the first year of growth, but the second year they were smaller, and the third year smaller. So they grew 5 meters in the first year and then grew back from the soil the second year. They were not adapted. So local species really are often more adapted. You have to make people learn about it. So for the last 10 years, we did a lot of TV shows, including the headlines of journals, because it has to be known, and farmers are very cautious, very reluctant to adopt that. So you have to show them that it works, to bring the farmers to the plots, to touch the tree, see how it works, and so on. And finally, you have also to be very cautious about how you push the word about it. Those pictures are interesting. The first one on the top is the picture from the pioneer farmer. He sent me that picture 20 years ago when I was starting my research. And he said, oh, I have been doing that for 20 years. And the other picture down is again in his farm. But those pictures, I was 3 months ago in Germany. We had the head people from the German Farmer Association. And when they saw that picture, they say, why? Because the width of the alley is not adapted to the width of the machinery. So you have to be very careful. You can give very poor words to the people by using not appropriate images. But those are historical plots, not what we say we should do today. And again, don't fear people, don't make people think that they will do acrobatic things like that. And that's why we have to prune the trees to get good quality timber, but it can be done in a very efficient, professional, and not dangerous way. So that's it. I wanted to push the idea of mixing uses at the plot level. That could be very useful for the future. It's an old idea. Maybe it's useful for the future. And there are a number of ideas like that. Some people think highways will produce electricity or in the future, or a simple tree that provides shade for chatting in Africa provides also for the trees because it's not dead. So that's also the mixture concept, and can be very useful. You can use trees for a number of things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very fascinating presentation. My question is, where did you receive your funding to build the photovoltaic panels? Was that a grant, or was it from private sources and donations? That's really my question.
We have a very practical approach. Everything for agroforestry, everything is done by farmers, so we don't pay for experiments. And for agrivoltaicism, we work with companies, private companies that do private plants for electricity. And we get some funds from the French Ministry for Research for the research only, but not for the panels and everything, because it's a very huge investment per hectare. So it's the companies that do that. Usually in France, there was a big pressure on farmers to give their land to these companies to put photovoltaic panels. It has been how you say, it's not legal anywhere any longer. It's forbidden to do now photovoltaic plants on agricultural land in France. So the companies are very keen to find a new way to make the two compatible.
Other questions?
Over here in the back.
Yeah.
Given the presentation before you and some of the concepts in natural farming, have you guys done any experimentation or thought of using hedges and kind of woody shrubs in those tree lines?
Mm-hmm. Right, of course. Well, in my experiments, we didn't. We started with very simple things, a cereal and trees. Okay, but now we are at a new stage where we include more vegetation in the system, including a number of species on the tree lines around the plots and so on. But there are a number of studies that address exactly the question that you raised at the moment, mostly for orchard protection, and they do a lot of research about hedges around orchards to provide predators for the pests of the orchards and so on. So in our plots, for farmers, just telling them to put back trees in their yards, in their plots, it's such a nightmare that we don't tell them, oh, and you put again berries and so on and so on and so on. So we make things simple. I'm working for the National Institute for Agronomical Research in France, and our mission is to address the mainstream farmer. So we have to start simple. That's it. But then farmers do a lot of different things, and it's a pleasure to visit them and say, oh, wow, yeah, so many things to explore, yeah.
Just about if your studies looked at allelopathy in trees and sort of what kinds of trees are better or what kinds of trees sort of prohibit growth around them, and if that factored into any of the things that you looked at.
If I get right your question, it's about the tree species adapted to the system, or because?
There are some trees that sort of prevent growth around them because they are emitting
allelopathy or
Yep.
these kind
Yep.
of things, yeah, okay. Well, we plant few trees per hectare, about 50 trees per hectare. So at that density, allelopathy is not really a problem so far. We have one example of one pine tree because we have some experiment with resinous species, and we have one example of one pine tree, Pinus brucia, a pine tree from the Eastern Europe, Eastern Mediterranean Sea, and the tree kills the vineyard. That's clear. So that's one example. But we don't have any significant example of wrong trees, I would say, trees that are really wrong with the crop so far, including walnut. Walnut is said to have allelopathy with juglone, and we can't measure it so far. But with 50 trees per hectare, that's not many trees. Well, I should have said that the famous pictures with the harvester, with the trees, the poplars, and so on, those experiments were planted 20 years ago, and the density of trees is much too high. Okay, so they give a wrong impression of what we recommend today. We recommend alleys, I would say 25 to 36 to 48 meters wide. And on those pictures, the alleys was only 13 meters. The idea is that when the tree is mature, when the tree is about to be harvested, the height of the tree should be the width of the alley, more or less. So if you have poplars that are 35 meters tall, like the poplars I had, it was much too dense.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, I think it's awesome planting trees into the fields, and I am planning to do some of that, but what about taking woods and turning them into, not necessarily, a perfectly straight, cropping situation, but a livestock situation? Mm-hmm. Does that, I mean, how does that work in reverse? Are those trees going to have root damage because they're surface roots, or?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. We have very traditional system of pigs and trees in Europe, in the dehesa system in Spain and Portugal. But those systems are, I would say, there is no young trees in the system because it's very difficult to regenerate it when you have pigs growing around. So the traditional system is to put it in defense for some years until the trees are big enough to resist the animals. Regarding the problems with the roots and the animal tramping and so on, yeah, I think it is a problem. You have to manage the animals very carefully when you have young trees. So there is a number of solutions to that problem, but I can't really discuss right now. But I think it is possible to have trees and animals and to plant young trees with animals, but you have to put the price for protecting the tree. The traditional way foresters in Europe, at least, foresters manage the system is to say animals out for 20 years. But if you do animals out for 20 years, you lose the grazing, you lose the browsing, and you got an invasion of shrubs and everything. So all we are doing is looking at new protections for the trees that allow the continuous grazing or browsing by animals. For pigs, I don't have really a solution, but in Europe, we put pigs in the woods only when you have acorns to eat. So it's a very short period, it's about 2 months, and I don't have the solution, but my Spanish or Portuguese colleagues could maybe answer better than me.
A question right here in front center.
Yep.
Related, actually, do you know of any research going on in Europe with grazing animals under voltaics?
Under what?
Research on grazing animals under voltaic.
Okay. Well, I know 1 or 2. Well, they just put sheep to clean the place, but it's not really designed for the system, you know. I would say that if we need to have really grazing and panels and animals, we would put the panels higher than they are actually doing because they are right to the ground. And that's, I would say it's more a commercial, an image that the manager of the system wants to have. He says, I put sheep, but just, he's not a sheep farmer, not at all. So I don't have examples, no. Do you have some?
Yes.
Yeah? In your farm?
We're working with a company. We're grazing sheep under about 5,000 acres of panels out in California, and those panels are within 18 inches of the ground.
Oh, great.
It's still in its 2nd year, but I just wondered if there was some things like that going on.
I'm interested.
Appreciate it.
So if you're
in New Mexico, we are in many places needing to thin forests, not clear cut them, but to make them not so full of little dog hair trees, as they're called. And I'm wondering if the same principles don't apply to trying to make a more savanna-like condition with grassland under a forest, and that many of the things that you've found, for example, the root depth and so on, aren't also very similar in the savanna forest, or what one might attempt to make.
Yeah. Yes, you can't translate what I have said to any environment, and I've been traveling in New Mexico and Arizona during the last 10 days, and I'm sure you have, it's not working everywhere in the same way. I was, just a very short story, I was overnighting in the bush some days ago, and I had no mattress. So I decided to harvest some dry grasses to build a mattress. And after a while, I realized that the grasses under the trees, they were much thicker, much dense. That was impressive. So that was juniperus, I think, trees. I don't know your trees, but and so I think even in a very dry environment like yours, there is some interesting relationship between trees and grasses and pasture and so on. But of course, what I have described here does not apply to your situation of very dry environment, where the trees, I think your trees have both deep roots and shallow roots to harvest the rain as soon as it comes. So I would not say that it's a recipe for everywhere. No.
Can we give a round of applause to Christian?